This is the fourth video in my First Growth Bordeaux series, Only Lafite Remains. So today we're taking a deep dive into Chateau Latour. I'll start out by briefly discussing Chateau Latour's illustrious history. I'll then discuss some reasons why Chateau Latour wines are so special. I will then discuss the 3 wines that Chateau Latour produces, including 2 stellar wines available for a fraction of the price of the top wine. Lastly, I'll discuss buying strategy for Chateau Latour wines, including my thoughts regarding top vintages and current best buys. First Growth Bordeaux producer Chateau Latour traces its history all the way back to 1331. Chateau Latour is named after the tower that was erected on its property way back in the late 1300s. Beginning as early as the 1700s and continuing through to the present day, Chateau Latour wines have been widely regarded as being among the best and most expensive wines in the entire world. And Chateau Latour was one of the 4 original First Growth Bordeaux producers in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux. Chateau Latour is one of 3 First Growth Bordeaux producers that are located in Pauillac, the other 2 being Lafite and Mouton. Chateau Latour has 92 hectares of vineyards. These vineyards are planted to 76% Cabernet Sauvignon, 22% Merlot, and the rest is made up of small traces of Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc is rarely used in the current blends. However, Latour does use a small amount of Petit Verdot. Petit Verdot can add a lot to wines, even in very, very small amounts. Specifically, it can add some color, some intriguing aromatics, and also some freshness and acidity. And so for that reason, producers have told me that even 0.5% of Petit Verdot can make a big impact on the finished wine. What is it that makes First Growth Bordeaux producer Chateau Latour and its wines so special? Well, it all starts with terroir. Of the 92 hectares of vineyards that Chateau Latour owns, 47 of them are the most prestigious parcel that surrounds the Chateau Latour estate and which are referred to as the enclos. Many in Bordeaux consider the enclos to contain the absolute best terroir in the entire region of Bordeaux. So certainly high praise indeed for this particular parcel. And it is only fruit from the enclos that is considered for inclusion in the Chateau Latour top wine. And I say considered for inclusion because this fruit still has to undergo a tasting evaluation before it is considered worthy of going into the top wine. That fruit that is determined not to be worthy of the top wine will be one of 3 different components of fruit that goes into the Les Forts de Latour. Chateau Latour's vineyard has varying aspects and soil types. Many of the First Growth Bordeaux vineyards are flat. However, Chateau Latour's vineyards has varying slopes and different aspects. These variations in elevations, aspect, and soil types allow Chateau Latour to achieve tremendous complexity in their wines due to the different blending components. Chateau Latour is also ideally situated near the Gironde estuary. The Gironde helps to moderate the temperatures and thus allows Chateau Latour to be insulated from much of the more inclement weather that can be experienced in the Bordeaux region. Many of the vines on the Chateau Latour estate are planted on gravelly soils near the Gironde estuary. Now you may have seen some rocks up here on these shelves in the past and wondered what those were. Well, one of them is this rock, which is a piece of gravel that comes from the Chateau Latour estate. As mentioned, almost 80% of the Chateau Latour vineyards are planted to Cabernet Sauvignon, and this gravelly soil is ideal for Cabernet Sauvignon for several reasons. First, Bordeaux can experience periods of heavy rain, and this sort of gravel is ideal for getting rid of the excess water that can otherwise cause mold and fungus in periods of heavy rain. Second, Cabernet Sauvignon ripens later than Merlot, and you can have fall rains in Bordeaux. It's very important that the Cabernet Sauvignon achieve full ripeness before the fall rains come. And this gravel is significant because during the day it can absorb heat and then it can radiate that heat to the vines at night. In this way, it helps to accelerate the ripening process for the Cabernet Sauvignon vines. Notably, however, there's also a layer of marly clay soils beneath all this gravel. This is significant because clay retains water. This allows the grapevines in Chateau Latour's estate to help withstand drought better than some other vineyards that do not have these clay soils at the bottom. The enclos vineyard has been 100% organic since 2015, and 50% of that vineyard is also being farmed biodynamically. How do all these vineyard considerations impact the final wine? Well, with Chateau Latour, you're talking about wines of power, concentration, intensity, and purity of fruit. This is a wine that's capable of aging for many decades, especially in top vintages. Chateau Latour wines become truly special after the tannins have integrated, the rough edges have faded, and the wine becomes seamless. It can take a long time for this to happen, however, but for those of you who have had enough patience to let that happen, or have been able to purchase an aged version, you will truly become a believer. The other great thing about Chateau Latour is that due to the vineyard considerations I mentioned earlier, Chateau Latour is often extremely consistent and able to make an outstanding wine even in a challenging vintage. What wines does First Growth Bordeaux producer Chateau Latour make? Well, there are 3 of them. I've spoken at length already about the top wine, the Chateau Latour. As mentioned, this one is produced exclusively from the vineyards that are called the Enclos. These vines average about 60 years of age. Cabernet Sauvignon is often 90% or more of the final blend, and these wines mature in 100% new French oak before they are released. The next wine produced by Chateau Latour is Les Forts de Latour. This name was first used in 1966, but this wine was only produced sporadically until 1990, at which point it was produced every single vintage. Chateau Latour has put tremendous effort into this wine, and as a result, it has achieved a classification of Médoc Grand Cru Classé, so it's certainly an excellent wine in its own right. There are 3 different fruit sources for Les Forts de Latour. The first component are the vines that are not quite in the Enclos, so they're on the edge of the Enclos. The second component is fruit from the Enclos that's tasted and adjudged not to be worthy of putting in the top wine. The third component consists of fruit from vines that are outside of the Enclos, but are still Chateau Latour estate-owned fruit. Chateau Latour ages this wine in 50 to 60% new oak, which is much less than the 100% for the top wine. And they always include a higher Merlot percentage than for the top wine, often about 25 to 35%. In terms of price, I've seen this one for about $250 to $300 or so for some of the newer releases. The other wine that's produced by Chateau Latour is the Le Pauillac de Chateau Latour. This wine has been produced every vintage since 1989. This wine was initially designed for the restaurant market, but has since been opened up for retail as well. The fruit for this wine comes from the young vines in the less highly regarded portions of Chateau Latour's vineyards, as well as from the fruit that does not make it into the Les Forts de Latour. To mature this wine, Chateau Latour uses only about 20% new French oak. This one often includes a very high percentage of Merlot, often about 45% or so. This is one that's designed to be consumed as early as 4 to 5 years after release, but will probably age up to 8 to 10 without any difficulty. I've seen this one selling for around $125 to $150 or so. And before I get to my Chateau Latour buying strategy, if you're getting value from this video, please be sure to smash that like button so it gets distributed to more viewers, and please do subscribe to my channel. That really does help me a great deal. And now for my buying strategy for First Growth Bordeaux producer Chateau Latour. Interestingly, unlike many of the top Bordeaux producers, Chateau Latour no longer participates in Entrepreneur or the Futures program. And so 2011 was the last vintage in which you were able to buy Chateau Latour as a future. Since that time, Chateau Latour has decided to age its wine at its cellar until it's deemed to be ready for release. So in the case of the 2012 vintage, that one was released in 2020 or so. Another thing to consider when buying Chateau Latour is the fact that this is not really a wine that you want to drink when it's very young. It can be incredibly structured, especially in top vintages. And in fact, I still don't think that the 1995 is ready to drink. That one still needs a few more years in my view. And so unless you have an extremely long time horizon, you're definitely going to want to focus on back vintages. And while I understand I did just say that the winery released the 2012 vintage in 2020 because they considered it to be ready to drink, their version of what's ready to drink and mine are very, very different. So certainly the 2012 vintage would be a wine that you would enjoy, but it would be very, very fruit forward. It would still be quite structured, and it's not going to be capable of showing the type of complexity and seamlessness and joy that you'd experience from this wine if you let it age another 10 to 15 years or more. Another factor that I think I need to mention is that there's been some dramatic price appreciation in the secondary market the past few months. And in fact, wines that I've seen for sale have been selling probably 25 to 30% or more above what they sold for even about 6 months ago. Last summer, for example, we were able to buy the 1990 Chateau Latour for about $700, but now that one's over $1,000. Likewise, top vintages like 1982 and 2000 appear to be selling for closer to $2,000, which is certainly much higher than they were a while back. All hope is not lost, however. As I mentioned, Chateau Latour is about as good as it gets when it comes to producing a strong wine in a challenging vintage. And so while I'm not generally an advocate of buying so-called off-vintage wines, with Chateau Latour, I definitely think that's a viable strategy. and one that's probably your best bet given the current financial circumstances. For example, I had a 1983 Latour a couple years ago. That's a wine that Robert Parker even considered to be below average. Over time, however, that wine has blossomed, and it was actually a very, very nice wine. And if you read a lot of the scores from the critics who have reviewed it more recently, you'll see that they're scoring it in the mid-90s, and it's become just a stellar, excellent wine. Notably, however, the price in the secondary market does not appear to have caught up to these more recent tastings and evaluations. And so I definitely think there's some value there. And the same would be true for other vintages, especially in the 1980s. Given the consistency of Latour, it's really hard to go wrong. And if you see an attractive price on a bottle of Chateau Latour, I would not hesitate to be opportunistic and snatch it up and give it a shot. Provided that it had adequate provenance, chances are it's going to be an exceptional wine. In terms of which vintages I consider to be the best, certainly 1982, 1990, 1995, and 1996. Then there's an incredible string beginning in 2000. Since 2000, the only vintages I would probably avoid would be 2007, 2011, and perhaps 2013 when it comes out. So when it comes to the top wine, I would just encourage you to be opportunistic and buy deals as you can find them, and otherwise just buy whatever you can consistent with your budgetary constraints. For those of you who have not yet tried Chateau Latour, I would definitely encourage you to try Les Forts de Latour and the Le Pauillac de Chateau Latour to get a feel for the house style in the meantime. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to check out the other 3 videos in this series on Chateau Haut-Brion, Chateau Margaux, and Chateau Mouton Rothschild, which are linked in the description below.